One of the least examined truths about 20th century warfare is that armies often learned more from civilians than from doctrine. This is easy to miss because post-war histories tend to frame survival knowledge as something invented inside military institutions. A similar misunderstanding appears when people talk about the Korean War, often assuming the extreme cold was an unforeseen anomaly rather than the result of a long pattern of armies repeatedly underestimating cold weather environments. That mistake had already been made, and partially corrected, during the Second World War. In the Arctic and subarctic theatres, Allied scouts survived not because of superior equipment alone, but because they quietly adopted techniques refined over centuries by Inuit communities. If you value these overlooked realities of military history, this is a good time to subscribe to Backyard Wisdom. This channel exists to preserve the kinds of hard-earned lessons that don't usually survive in official summaries or battlefield maps. When it came to Arctic warfare, it really exposed the limits of industrial military thinking. The Arctic just did not reward standardization. Allied planners, at first, figured that surviving the cold was simply a matter of issuing thicker clothing and better stoves. What they actually discovered, though, was that cold kills through misjudgment more often than through exposure. Scouts operating in Greenland, northern Canada, Alaska, and Arctic Norway faced temperatures where, honestly, sweating could be fatal, metal could injure bare skin, and, well, shelter placement mattered more than firepower. Inuit communities had already solved these problems, not through technology in the modern sense, but through disciplined habits shaped by environment. The key shift for Allied units was recognizing that survival was not equipment-driven, but behavior-driven. This realization would quietly influence later cold weather doctrine, even if it was rarely credited to its original sources. How Inuit instruction reshaped how scouts moved across snow and ice. One of the earliest lessons Allied scouts learned was that speed was, honestly, less important than consistency. Inuit travel methods emphasized a steady pacing, deliberate rest intervals, and, reading the terrain carefully. Scouts were taught to avoid sweating at all costs, even during periods of exertion. Clothing was adjusted constantly, not just layered on permanently. This approach ran counter to conventional military instincts which, favored fixed uniforms and standardized movement rates. Movement techniques also changed. Instead of marching in rigid formations, scouts adopted staggered spacing and followed natural contours in the snow. Wind-packed ridges were favored over deep drifts, and ice thickness was assessed visually long before any physical test was attempted. These practices reduced fatigue, injury, and noise, giving scouts a quiet mobility advantage in environments where mechanical transport often failed. So here's the thing. Inuit clothing principles really mattered far more than the standard issue gear. The way they approached clothing wasn't just about covering up, it was about survival in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. When Allied forces entered the Arctic, they brought along gear made from wool, leather, and canvas. These materials were picked mostly for their durability, not necessarily for how they handled the cold or, thermal behavior. Inuit clothing systems, on the other hand, really focused on breathability, moisture management, and adaptability. This approach made all the difference, allowing them to stay warm and dry while moving through the Arctic environment. Caribou and seal skins, when properly prepared, trapped heat while allowing vapor to escape. While scouts rarely used traditional skins directly, They adopted the underlying principles. Boot systems were modified to allow moisture to freeze outward rather than soak inward. Insulation was adjusted based on activity rather than temperature alone. Hoods replaced helmets whenever tactically possible, recognizing that heat loss from the head affected judgment and endurance. These changes reduced frost injuries and honestly improved alertness, especially during long observation missions. Instead of strictly following doctrine, the placement of shelters was guided by environmental logic. This approach meant that every decision was shaped by the realities of the land and climate, not just by traditional rigid rules. Inuit shelters were never placed arbitrarily. Scouts, became skilled at reading the patterns of snow accumulation, to figure out wind direction, the path of prevailing storms, and even where thermal pockets might form. This knowledge helped them choose the safest and most comfortable spots for shelter. Shelters were carefully positioned where snow could act as insulation rather than a threat to bury them. Often, these spots were tucked behind natural windbreaks that, honestly, might seem insignificant to untrained eyes, but made all the difference in surviving harsh conditions. Snow was no longer treated as an obstacle, but as a building material. Compacting and shaping snow walls reduced wind exposure dramatically, even without enclosed structures. This understanding allowed scouts to rest safely without fires, avoiding smoke, light, and fuel consumption. The lesson was clear: concealment and warmth were often the same problem solved by different means. Why fire use was minimized rather than maximized. Conventional survival thinking often treats fire as the primary solution to cold, but interestingly, Inuit practice actually treated fire as a last resort. Scouts learned, sometimes the hard way, that fire revealed their position, consumed scarce fuel, and even encouraged risky sweating during cold starts. So instead they prioritized insulation diet and, of course, movement discipline. When fire was truly necessary, it was used only briefly and, very strategically. Snow platforms were built to prevent heat loss into the ground, and windshields were carefully shaped to direct heat efficiently. These methods allowed small amounts of fuel to achieve meaningful warming without compromising security or endurance. Later military cold weather manuals would quietly echo these principles, though rarely acknowledging their origin. How Inuit food strategies influenced endurance and decision-making. Caloric needs in Arctic conditions are extreme, but Inuit diets emphasized fat density rather than volume. Allied scouts learned that, frequent small intakes of high-energy food actually stabilized body temperature and reduced fatigue better than infrequent large meals. Frozen food was not exactly avoided, but instead managed carefully, since chewing and digestion generated heat without requiring any extra fuel. Scouts also learned to really respect hydration, which was actually an often overlooked risk in cold environments. Snow was never eaten directly. Instead, it was melted gradually to avoid lowering core temperature. These practices improved mental clarity, which, honestly, mattered just as much as physical strength during those long reconnaissance missions. So why did these lessons matter beyond the Second World War? The value of Inuit-taught survival methods became evident again during the Korean War, when United Nations forces, initially repeated many of the same mistakes. Units that had inherited Arctic survival knowledge, consistently performed better in cold conditions, while those relying solely on equipment suffered disproportionate casualties from exposure and exhaustion. The continuity is rarely emphasized, but it really underscores how institutional memory shapes outcomes, long after the original context has faded. Modern cold weather training, from special forces to civilian search and rescue units, still reflects these principles, even today. Moisture control, terrain reading, shelter placement, and caloric strategy all trace back to practices refined long before industrial warfare existed. What these stories reveal about preparedness and humility is, honestly, quite profound. They remind us that no matter how skilled or equipped we might be, a sense of readiness paired with genuine modesty is absolutely essential for survival in the harshest conditions. The most important lesson from Inuit-influenced Arctic survival, isn't really technical at all. It's cultural. Allied scouts survived because they were willing to learn from people their institutions initially overlooked. That willingness to listen and adapt made all the difference. They accepted that experience mattered more than rank, and that in truth the environment dictated behavior, not the other way around. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the wisdom to adapt outweighs any badge or title. This humility saved lives, and, it also challenges modern assumptions about preparedness, reminding us that resilience often depends on listening rather than inventing. Historical survival knowledge is cumulative, and honestly, ignoring its origins weakens our ability to apply it effectively. Why remembering these overlooked collaborations still matters. The Arctic campaigns of World War II, were not really defined by large battles, but rather by endurance, restraint, and adaptation. Inuit knowledge quietly shaped Allied success in environments where, honestly, industrial solutions alone just failed. These contributions, they deserve recognition not as curiosities, but as foundational elements of modern survival doctrine. Understanding these stories really deepens our appreciation of how wars are actually fought and survived. It also reinforces a broader truth. The most durable knowledge often comes from those who lived with the land long before armies ever arrived. If you value careful historical analysis and lessons that remain relevant beyond their era, go ahead and subscribe to Backyard Wisdom and share this documentary with others who care about understanding the past in a deeper, more honest way.